1. Shock hooked at a U.S. senator leans forward, his voice dipped in condescension, his words sharpened like blades. Mitt Romney, a man who has sat at the highest tables of power, looks across the room and fires the question that slices through the air. But tell me, what experience do you really have to speak on this matter? The chamber stiffens. Cameras swivel. Staffers freeze mid-note. For a heartbeat, the echo of his challenge lingers in the silence, hanging like a storm cloud ready to burst. Across the table sits Jasmine Crockett. Young, black, unshaken. Her hands remain steady, her eyes fixed on him with the kind of calm that unnerves. She does not flinch, does not fumble. In that silence, the power shifts. The senator's smirk lingers, confident he has cornered her, confident this freshman voice will falter. But what happens next will leave him, and the nation, speechless. Crockett breathes in, her gaze cutting sharper than any rebuttal yet spoken. Her reply does not thunder. It lands quieter, heavier, like a weight the room cannot escape. Every syllable radiates lived struggle, courtroom battles, and the kind of experience no Ivy League resume could ever contain. And in seconds, the smirk fades. Romney's composure cracks. The silence deepens, now transformed into awe. The cameras catch it. The wide eyes of those in the gallery, the ripple of stunned expressions among colleagues, the flicker of disbelief across Romney's face. It is not just a rebuttal. It is a reversal, a dismantling of arrogance in real time. Outside the chamber, screens across America light up. Phones buzz. Clips spread faster than words can describe. Who is this woman? How did she just silence Mitt Romney? Viewers replay the moment, over and over, drinking in the dignity that shattered condescension. For some, it is validation. For others, revelation. For all, it is unforgettable. But this moment did not appear out of thin air. It was not luck, nor a fluke of timing. It was the eruption of a life forged in fire, of a woman underestimated too many times, standing at the crossroads of history. And to understand why this exchange shook the nation, to grasp how Jasmine Crockett turned dismissal into dominance, we must go back. Back to the roots of power, back to the struggles that shaped her, and back to the arrogance that set this confrontation in motion. Because this was never just a question. It was a test. And the answer would change everything. Point 2. Raise the stakes. The clash did not unfold in a vacuum. This was not a casual exchange of words between equals. It was a moment that carried the weight of America's shifting identity, its growing divides, and its desperate hunger for voices that cut through the noise. The hearing had been called to examine issues that touched every household. Yet as the cameras rolled, it became something more. It became a stage for the old guard and the new guard, privilege and perseverance, legacy and lived struggle, to collide. For Mitt Romney, the room felt familiar. He had spent decades in halls like these, committee chambers, press rooms, presidential debate stages. He was comfortable with the lights, with the probing cameras, with the expectation that his voice would dominate. He carried himself as establishment royalty, the son of a governor, a titan of business, a senator whose name had already been etched into the history of American politics. To Romney, power was an inheritance, experience a birthright. He expected deference because he had always received it. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. New, young, a freshman congresswoman from Texas who, in the eyes of many in that chamber, was supposed to be forgettable. To them, she was one more face in a sea of newcomers, idealistic, perhaps passionate, but unseasoned, untested, easy to dismiss. They thought she was just another freshman congresswoman. That underestimation was the quiet pulse beneath the room. Every time she adjusted her papers, every time she leaned toward the microphone, there were those who assumed her words would carry little weight. After all, how could her years in the courtroom compare to Romney's years in the Senate? How could her background of fighting for tenants, for the wrongly accused, for working families, measure against the carefully polished resume of a man who once stood at the doorstep of the presidency? But this is where the stakes sharpened. Because Crockett's presence in that room represented something bigger than herself. She was not just carrying her own voice. She carried the weight of every underestimated voice, every outsider told to wait their turn, every immigrant child reminded they were not part of the club. When Romney posed his question, it was not merely one senator challenging one congresswoman. It was the embodiment of establishment privilege attempting to snuff out the credibility of those who had clawed their way into the room. The cameras captured it all, and audiences watching felt the tension build. To Romney's allies, this was a moment to reaffirm hierarchy, to remind the freshmen that power belongs to the seasoned. To Crockett's supporters, and to millions who would soon stumble across the clip, it was a test, a challenge to prove that dignity and experience are not defined by pedigrees or family names. This is why the exchange mattered. It was not only about policy or procedure. It was about whose voices get to count in America and who gets silenced. It was about whether resilience could stand shoulder to shoulder with privilege and emerge unbroken. And it was about a man who believed his question would reduce his opponent to silence, only to discover that silence would belong to him. The audience could sense it, even before Crockett spoke. The hushed air, the sharpened focus, the way the senator's words seemed to hang in the chamber like a challenge too sharp to ignore. It was a duel, whether he knew it or not. But Romney didn't know who he was really up against. 3. Antagonist backstory. Mitt Romney's story begins in comfort. Born into a family where doors were already open, where wealth and influence paved smoother roads than most Americans could ever imagine, Romney grew up surrounded by the kind of privilege that turns ambition into expectation. His father, George Romney, had been a governor, a cabinet secretary, even a presidential hopeful himself. Politics was not just an interest, it was an inheritance. For young Mitt, the corridors of power were not intimidating. They were familiar, like family hallways he had walked 1,000 times. From there, his rise seemed inevitable. Harvard degrees in hand, Romney stepped effortlessly into the world of business, quickly ascending to the top of Bain Capital, a firm whose very name would later stir controversy. He built wealth upon wealth, navigating mergers and acquisitions with the cold precision of a surgeon. To his admirers, he was the embodiment of American success, disciplined, intelligent, driven. To his critics, he was the face of a system where profit outweighed people, where the lives of workers were reduced to numbers on a balance sheet. Politics, however, was always in his blood. In Massachusetts, he remade himself as a pragmatic moderate, running for Senate in 1994 against Ted Kennedy, then governor in 2002. His crowning achievement during that period, healthcare reform, was lauded as a bipartisan breakthrough, a rare moment where compassion and pragmatism aligned. Yet it also revealed Romney's central contradiction. He was a man willing to bend, to shift, to mold his image depending on the audience he faced. The same healthcare plan that brought him praise in Massachusetts became a liability when he sought the Republican presidential nomination years later. Suddenly, what was once a triumph of policy became an albatross around his neck. Romney's presidential bids, 2008 and 2012, showcased that same duality. In one moment, he was the polished statesman, the steady hand. In another, he was the awkward candidate delivering infamous lines about the 47%. He could project moral seriousness, yet he could also slip into opportunistic pandering. He condemned extremism at times, even voting to convict Donald Trump during impeachment, but just as often, he seemed to retreat into the comfort of party lines, unwilling to risk too much, and woven through it all was a pattern, an instinct, perhaps subconscious, to measure worth through pedigree rather than pain. Romney's sense of experience was born of boardrooms and Senate chambers, not of grassroots struggles or courtroom battles. To him, authority came from titles, from wealth, from the polish of a resume that gleamed with institutions and inheritance. When he encountered younger, less pedigreed challengers, especially women, especially people of color, his instinct leaned toward dismissal. It was not always explicit, but it was there, in the tilt of his head, in the phrasing of a question, in the expectation that their credibility could be undercut with a single probing remark. He was not always cruel. Sometimes he stood against cruelty, calling out the ugliest voices within his own party. But even then, his moral stance carried the air of someone who believed he was above the fray, the adult in the room reminding others of the rules. Rarely did he seem to grasp the lived realities of those outside his own orbit. The teachers juggling 2 jobs, the immigrants navigating hostile systems, the activists who didn't inherit influence but fought tooth and nail for it. This was the man who sat across from Jasmine Crockett, convinced that a single question about experience could strip her of credibility. This was the senator who had weathered debates with presidents, tangled with governors, jousted with CEOs. To him, she was an easy mark, young, unseasoned, an outsider. And in his worldview, outsiders rarely belonged for long. Yet what Romney could not see, what he had never truly had to face, was the strength that comes not from inheritance, but from hardship. Crockett was not armed with silver spoons or family dynasties. Her experience was not polished in ivy-covered halls or cushioned boardrooms. It was hardened in late nights preparing cases, in battles for the voiceless, in the relentless push against a system that underestimated her at every turn. Romney brought to that chamber the weight of legacy, of establishment expectation. Crockett brought something else entirely, something he could not quantify, could not dismiss, could not silence. Because while Romney's story was written in comfort and contradiction, Crockett's was forged in fire, not silver spoons. And the blaze of that fire was about to burn through his assumptions. Point 4. Protagonist backstory. Jasmine Crockett, that long before she sat across from Mitt Romney in that charged chamber, Jasmine Crockett was already fighting battles most politicians never imagined. She was not born into the comforts of power. She did not inherit a last name that opened doors. Her path was not gilded with expectation. It was carved from grit. Growing up in St. Louis, Crockett learned early what it meant to be underestimated. She understood what it felt like to carry both race and gender as double burdens in spaces where authority was rarely granted to people who looked like her. The daughter of working-class parents, she saw firsthand how families scraped by, how communities bore the weight of inequality. For her, politics was never an abstract game of chess played in Washington. It was about survival, about dignity, about the everyday fight to make a system notice people it was designed to ignore. Law became her weapon. In courtrooms across Texas, Crockett built a reputation not as someone who chased prestige, but as someone who fought for those with no other advocate. She took on cases others dismissed, tenants facing eviction, workers wronged by employers, young black men pulled into a justice system tilted against them. Every case demanded more than skill, it demanded resilience. Judges doubted her. Opposing counsel underestimated her. Yet time and again, she dismantled assumptions with preparation, precision, and sheer will. These were not glamorous battles. There were no headlines, no viral clips. Just long hours, heavy files, and the steady grind of service. But within those hours, Crockett was sharpening the very skills that would one day silence a U.S. senator. She learned to stay calm under pressure, to anticipate the strike of arrogance, to turn an attack into an opening. Every cross-examination, every closing argument, was a rehearsal for the moment the nation would one day witness. The barriers she faced were not only professional, they were personal. As a black woman in politics, she walked into rooms where eyes narrowed before she spoke, where whispers questioned whether she belonged. The old gatekeepers wanted her passion contained, her voice softened, her ambition delayed. But Crockett refused containment. Instead, she leaned into the very identity others sought to dismiss. Her race, her gender, her outsider status, these were not weaknesses. They were her armor. They tethered her to communities overlooked, to struggles too many in power preferred to ignore. Her entry into politics was never about chasing titles. It was about protecting those who had always been voiceless. When she ran for office, she faced the skepticism reserved for outsiders. She can't raise enough money. She can't build a coalition. She can't win. And yet, step by step, she defied each doubt. Her campaign was powered not by big donors, but by the people she had served. Neighbors, clients, activists, families who believed in her because they had seen her fight for them. When she entered Congress, the skepticism followed. To many, she was a newcomer, untested, easy to overlook. She was not a household name, not part of the old guard. But what those skeptics missed was that her strength had never come from Washington's approval. It had been born in the trenches, built on the front lines of justice. And so, when Crockett walked into that chamber to face Mitt Romney, she carried more than a title. She carried the weight of every courtroom where she had stood against power and refused to back down. She carried the voices of those silenced by inequality, the faith of communities that had trusted her with their fight. Each scar from her journey was not a mark of weakness, but a testament to endurance. Every courtroom battle prepared her for this exact moment. The glares, the dismissals, the arrogance of men who assumed she was less. She had seen it all before. And every time, she had turned that arrogance into fueled SO. When Romney asked his question, dripping with the entitlement of privilege, Crockett did not hear a challenge to her resume. She heard the echo of every time someone told her she was not enough. She heard the doubts of teachers who underestimated her, the skepticism of colleagues who questioned her, the murmurs of gatekeepers who believed her place was at the margins. And with that history coursing through her, she delivered a response that transformed silence into respect. Romney saw a freshman congresswoman. America saw something else entirely. A woman whose every trial, every struggle, every victory had led her to this precise confrontation. A woman whose lived experience outweighed pedigrees and polished resumes. A woman whose dignity carried more authority than decades of privilege. And when Romney tried to reduce her, she rose higher than ever. 5. Debate escalation. That the chamber was already tense, but when Mitt Romney leaned into the microphone, the energy shifted. His voice carried that unmistakable tone, measured, deliberate, yet steeped in condescension. "Congresswoman," he began, his syllables clipped, "I respect your passion, but passion is not experience. Could you tell us, what real experience do you have to speak on matters of this scale?" It was the kind of question designed to shrink its target, to reduce a lifetime of work into a single dismissive jab. Romney's phrasing was surgical, each word dipped in superiority, polished with the confidence of a man who had spent decades assuming his authority was unshakable. To his supporters, it sounded firm, even righteous. To others, it reeked of entitlement, a challenge not born of curiosity but of arrogance. The room reacted before Crockett did. A few staffers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A murmur rippled along the back row where interns exchanged glances, uncertain if they'd just witnessed a line crossed. The journalists in the press gallery stiffened, pens ready, cameras suddenly trained more tightly on the woman at the center of the storm. The moment had cracked the air open, and everyone inside the chamber knew it. Crockett sat still. Her shoulders did not slump, her eyes did not dart. She let the silence breathe, let Romney's words echo longer than he had intended. Calm, deliberate, she fixed her gaze on him, not with anger, but with a steadiness that was almost unnerving. It was the look of someone who had heard variations of that question 100 times before, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in every space where gatekeepers doubted she belonged. Romney seemed to misinterpret the silence. He sat back in his chair, lips curled slightly, as though convinced his point had landed. He adjusted his notes, already preparing to move on, confident that his remark had drawn a boundary around Crockett's credibility. It was the smugness of a man who believed the exchange was over, but the cameras told a different story. They zoomed closer, catching the quiet intensity in Crockett's face, the fire behind her stillness. The audience could see it. She was not cornered. She was gathering. A whisper swept through the chamber, soft gasps, murmurs that slipped into the air like a warning. Those who had seen Crockett in court recognized the pause. It was the calm before the strike, the inhale before the cross-examination that would flip the entire case upside down. For Crockett, time seemed to slow. She replayed his words in her head, each syllable dripping with the arrogance of privilege. "What real experience do you have?" The question wasn't new. It was every doubt she had faced wrapped into a single sentence. But in Romney's mouth, it carried an extra sting, because it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, who had ever been measured against the yardstick of pedigree rather than resilience. She did not rush. She did not stumble. She let him wait, let the weight of his own words hang in the silence. Around her, phones buzzed silently as clips already began to circulate online. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing that something was about to happen. Romney shifted again, just slightly, perhaps noticing that the silence no longer worked in his favor. The smirk faded, replaced with a flicker of unease. He had expected a rebuttal, maybe even a flustered defense. What he was getting instead was something entirely different. Control. The tension was unbearable now, the kind of silence that demands release. All eyes turned to Crockett, waiting to see if she would falter, if she would lash out, or if she would rise. Then, Crockett leaned in, and history was about to be made. 6. The mic drop counterattacked. The room was silent, charged, waiting for her to stumble. But Jasmine Crockett didn't stumble. She leaned toward the microphone, the faintest curve of determination pulling at her lips, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, low, deliberate, undeniable. "Senator," she began, "I appreciate the question. Truly, because it gives me the chance to remind you, and everyone here, what real experience looks like." The first words landed softly, but their weight was immediate. The chamber stilled, the press gallery leaned forward, and the cameras zoomed in as though they already knew they were about to catch history in motion. Crockett did not rush. She let each syllable breathe, her cadence controlled, each pause sharpening anticipation. "I don't come from a family of governors," she continued. "I didn't grow up with my path paved by wealth, or by connections, or by a last name that opened every door before I knocked. My experience wasn't inherited. It was earned, case by case, client by client, battle by battle." A murmur rippled through the audience. Crockett's tone was not bitter. It was resolute, the calm fire of a woman speaking from truth. Her eyes locked on Romney, unwavering. "I've stood in courtrooms where no cameras were watching, where no headlines would ever be written, fighting for people who had no one else to fight for them. I've defended tenants about to lose their homes, workers cheated by employers, young men pushed into a system stacked against them. I've been in the trenches, Senator. And if that doesn't qualify as experience, then perhaps we need to ask, what exactly do you mean by experience?" The question twisted, suddenly turning the blade back on Romney. The words were precise, yet devastating. Crockett had not raised her voice, but the power of her calm dismantled his challenge piece by piece. Romney blinked. His posture, once relaxed and confident, tightened. The slight smirk that had danced across his lips was gone. He leaned back, papers shuffled, eyes narrowed as if recalibrating. But Crockett wasn't finished. Because if experience is defined only by time spent in these halls, by titles held, by offices occupied, then what you're really saying is that power itself is experience. But that's not true. Power is privilege. Experience is lived. And my lived experience has taught me more about justice, about resilience, and about the people this government is supposed to serve than any boardroom or inheritance ever could. Gasps rose, faint but audible. Someone in the back muttered a soft wow. Even through the cameras, the energy was palpable. Crockett had flipped the script entirely, redefining the terms of the debate. She paused then, deliberately, letting the weight of her words settle like dust after an explosion. The silence was no longer Romney's weapon, it was hers. And in that stillness, the senator's face told the story. First stern, then unsettled, then faintly flushed with the realization that the ground beneath him was shifting. Crockett leaned back slightly, only to lean in again, her voice unwavering. "You ask me what experience I have. Let me tell you. I have the experience of being underestimated again and again and proving people wrong. I have the experience of building a career not on privilege, but on persistence. I have the experience of fighting battles that were never televised, but changed lives all the same. And I have the experience of walking into rooms like this one, where people look at me and assume I don't belong, only to remind them, with every word I speak, that I do." The words hit harder than any raised voice could. She was not angry. She was undeniable. Romney shifted again, clearing his throat, eyes darting briefly toward his notes as though searching for a lifeline. But there was none. The narrative was gone. He was no longer the examiner. He was the examined. Crockett pressed forward, her tone lifting, rising like a wave, building momentum. "So if the measure of experience is whether one has spent decades guarding privilege, then no, I don't share that experience. But if the measure is whether one has stood with the people this government too often forgets, then my experience is deeper, broader, and more real than you will ever admit." The chamber erupted, not in noise, but in awe. A few audible claps slipped through before being hushed, as if even applause felt inadequate for the gravity of what had just been spoken. Reporters scribbled furiously. Clips would soon circulate with captions already writing themselves. Crockett silences Romney. And still, she was not done. "It wasn't pedigree that brought me here, Senator. It was people. It was their trust, their hope, their belief that someone like me, someone who looks like them, who knows their struggle, could stand in these halls and speak truth to power. That is my experience. That is my credential. And that is something no dynasty, no resume, no privilege can replicate. Her voice lingered, final, decisive. She didn't need to add more. The contrast was complete. Romney sat stiffly now, lips pressed into a thin line. His attempt at authority had dissolved into silence, and silence was not his to command anymore. His eyes shifted downward for a moment before returning to her, but the damage was done. His challenge had backfired. The room knew it. The cameras knew it. America knew IT wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Calm, precise, with the weight of authenticity that privilege could never mimic. Crockett hadn't simply answered his question, she had redefined it, leaving no ground for rebuttal. Romney opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. The senator, the man of wealth and legacy, had no words. For the first time in a long career, he was the one left speechless. And as Crockett leaned back, eyes still steady, the room itself seemed to exhale, aware that it had just witnessed a turning point. And the aftermath? That would explode far beyond the hearing room. 7. The aftermath shockwaves that the moment Crockett's words landed, the hearing room seemed suspended in time. But outside, the world erupted. Phones buzzed, notifications exploded, and within minutes, clips of the exchange were circulating across every platform imaginable. Twitter lit up with hashtags that felt like a chorus of validation. Hashtag Crockett speaks. Hashtag experience matters. Hashtag dignity over arrogance. Memes proliferated, capturing Romney's stunned expression beside Crockett's calm defiance, captioned with everything from witty quips to heartfelt admiration. People watched, rewound, and watched again. Progressive communities online cheered, claiming the moment as their own. She spoke for all of us, typed one user, their post quickly going viral. Another added, finally, someone reminds them that lived experience beats privilege every time. Streams of comments poured in, voices from across the country affirming what they had felt but rarely seen expressed so boldly. Parents shared it with their children, activists shared it with their networks, and students shared it with friends who had long struggled to see themselves represented in the corridors of power. News channels scrambled to catch up. Headlines appeared within the hour. Freshman Congresswoman silences veteran senator. Crockett's calm response breaks the internet. Experience versus privilege, a lesson for America. Pundits debated, some attempting to downplay the moment, others praising the sheer mastery of Crockett's delivery. Evening news shows dissected the exchange line by line, analysts comparing rhetorical strategies, political experience, and moral authority. On cable debates, commentators argued over who had won the interaction, but few could deny the shift in perception. Dignity had overshadowed arrogance. Calm had overwhelmed entitlement. Even celebrities and influencers joined the conversation. Authors, musicians, and actors tweeted their support, praising her poise and courage. They highlighted the historical significance of the exchange, framing it as more than a congressional hearing. It was a cultural moment, a mirror held up to a nation grappling with questions of power, representation, and justice. Videos of Crockett's response were shared by accounts with millions of followers, amplifying her words beyond the political sphere, transforming a legislative hearing into a viral demonstration of resilience and intellect. Fans and strangers alike began sharing personal stories alongside the clip, connecting Crockett's triumph to their own experiences of being underestimated or marginalized. Immigrants, young women, people of color, and anyone who had faced condescension found a sense of solidarity in her words. She said what I've always wanted to say, wrote one user, their post accumulating thousands of likes and retweets. Another commented, I feel seen. I feel heard. Finally, someone spoke truth in the way it deserves to be spoken. The emotional resonance was immediate, palpable, and unstoppable. Political blogs dissected the implications for Washington itself. If a freshman congresswoman could shift the narrative against a figure like Romney, what did that mean for the balance of influence? Social media theorists wrote think pieces on viral civics, noting how moments of authenticity now rival decades of incumbency in shaping public perception. Memes evolved into mini commentaries on privilege versus perseverance, and Twitter threads became virtual classrooms on leadership, dignity, and the real meaning of experience. Across platforms, the same theme repeated. People were not just impressed, they were inspired. They shared clips with hashtags, with commentary, with their own stories. It wasn't just political validation. It was emotional and social affirmation. The exchange had become a mirror, reflecting what citizens wanted to see in their leaders: courage, calm, and uncompromising integrity. Yet even as the hashtags trended, the commentators argued, and celebrities amplified her voice, something deeper lingered beneath the surface. The digital applause, the viral clips, the endless retweets, they captured the spectacle, but they only scratched the surface of what had truly happened. The shockwaves extended far beyond entertainment or social media metrics. Because the true power of Crockett's response wasn't in trending hashtags. It was in the lesson it carried. Point 8. Resolution. And in the wake of the hearing, as the social media buzz continued to pulse and news cycles churned, Jasmine Crockett's words settled into something far larger than the moment itself. She had not merely answered a question. She had reframed it, transforming a challenge into a lesson for the nation. Experience, she reminded the world, is not a measure of inheritance or title. It is measured by resilience, by the courage to stand for those who cannot, by the willingness to fight in places where recognition is scarce and stakes are high. Across the country, viewers began to understand that the confrontation was more than a single political exchange. It was a metaphor for every space where voices have been underestimated or dismissed. Every student told they couldn't succeed. Every immigrant reminded they don't belong. Every young professional questioned because of age, race, or gender. Crockett's calm defiance spoke to them. It was a universal reminder that true authority comes from action, from service, from enduring challenges, and turning struggle into accomplishment. The moral clarity of the moment was undeniable. Romney had decades of office, decades of influence, decades of inherited power. Crockett had decades of work in the trenches, defending the marginalized, advocating for justice, confronting inequality wherever it surfaced. And in that single exchange, America could hear the difference. Lived truth had eclipsed entitlement. Dignity had overshadowed arrogance. The chamber itself, once filled with tension and expectation, now echoed with a sense of clarity. Experience is not handed down. It is forged. Crockett's response also carried an essential lesson about perception and value. The world often measures credibility by markers that can be bought or inherited: degrees from elite institutions, long tenure, polished resumes. But Crockett's triumph revealed that substance cannot be faked and authenticity cannot be underestimated. Her experience, built on service and struggle, held a power that no pedigree could rival. Every courtroom battle, every community she uplifted, every obstacle she overcame had prepared her for this defining moment. And in the silence that followed her words, that preparation became visible to all. For those watching, there was inspiration in the story's rhythm. Setbacks do not define potential. Marginalization does not define worth. And the voice of truth cannot be silenced by privilege alone. Crockett embodied the principle that anyone underestimated can rise, and anyone underestimated who stands firm and speaks with purpose can command the room, regardless of status or expectation. Her victory was not just political. It was symbolic, a beacon for anyone who has been told they do not belong. And yet, the power of the moment extended beyond symbolism. It was a demonstration of integrity in practice. Crockett did not attack. She did not lash out. She did not let anger dictate her words. Instead, she wielded precision, poise, and unwavering truth. In doing so, she offered a masterclass in moral authority, showing that strength and dignity are inseparable, and that true leadership elevates rather than diminishes. The crescendo of the lesson landed with undeniable force. Dignity will always outshine arrogance, and lived truth will always surpass inherited power. Romney's decades in office could not replicate what Crockett had lived. The nation saw it, felt it, and understood it. In the quiet moments after the microphones went silent, in the reflections of those watching at home, and in the whispers exchanged in offices and classrooms alike, the message resonated. Experience is earned, resilience matters more than pedigree, and the courage to act defines true authority. Romney had decades in office. Crockett had decades in the trenches. And America heard the difference. This was not a victory for one individual alone. It was a triumph for anyone who has been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked. It was proof that courage, preparation, and service are the ultimate credentials, and that when lived truth meets the right moment, it has the power to reshape perceptions, inspire a nation, and redefine what experience really means. And the story was far from over. 9. Outro. Mitt Romney questioned her experience, but Jasmine Crockett's answer left him speechless. And in that silence, the truth rang louder than any title, any pedigree, any inherited privilege. It was a moment that reminded the nation that experience is not measured in years or offices held. It is measured in resilience, in service, in the courage to stand for what is right when the world expects you to remain silent. But Crockett's calm, precise, and unwavering response was more than a rebuttal. It was a lesson. Dignity always outshines arrogance. Lived truth always eclipses inherited power. Every courtroom battle, every struggle, every triumph had prepared her for this confrontation, and she turned what was meant to belittle into a declaration of strength. For anyone who has been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked, her words were a beacon. Your experience matters, your voice matters, and your perseverance can command the attention of even the most powerful. This is the power of standing firm, of speaking with purpose, and of refusing to let arrogance define the terms of the conversation. It is proof that integrity and courage are the ultimate credentials, and that a single moment of clarity can ripple across a nation, inspiring others to rise, to speak, and to act. If you believe truth still matters, share this moment. Subscribe, join the movement, and let's keep amplifying voices of dignity. Spread the story, lift the overlooked, celebrate the courage that cannot be bought or inherited. Because when lived experience meets conviction, history listens, and the world can no longer ignore it.